It's a forgotten and harrowing story of heroism and bravery. Exhausted, strung out on the Iraqi desert plain, and caught in a devastating ambush, nearly 1,000 British and Indian troops were going to enter the fight of their lives. This is the story of the destruction of the Manchester Column, known to some as the Battle of Hillah. We're going old school, clasps of courage, today. If you look at some of my earlier videos, you'll know that on occasion I like to put the medals aside and temporarily look at a specific battle or campaign. This engagement has fascinated me for years, but until recently I've not ever found much information about it. We've heard of Isandlwana, Maiwand, Majuba Hill, the retreat from Kabul, even Ntombe Drift for you hardcore British military history geeks. But have you heard of a British disaster in Iraq in 1920 where nearly 1,000 men, mainly from the Manchester Regiment, were destroyed by Arab insurgents? This was a desperate engagement which led to over a dozen gallantry medals being awarded, including a Victoria Cross. This action is still so obscure, no one has really agreed on a name for it. The destruction of the Manchester Column, the Hillah ambush, or the Battle of Hillah. Take your pick. I certainly hadn't heard of this engagement until one day I stumbled upon a largely abandoned memorial discarded in the desert, which opened my eyes to a piece of forgotten history. For a number of years, I worked in Iraq as a security consultant and got to travel around most parts of the country. One day, I was lucky enough to visit the Basra Memorial. It commemorates over 40,000 Commonwealth Forces members who died during the Mesopotamian campaign in Iraq and after World War I. Originally situated 8 kilometres north of Basra, near the Battle Arab River, in the 1990s it was moved by Saddam, who wasn't too chipper with the British at the time, and placed in the desert. Looking at the names, I saw many belonging to the Manchester Regiment. These appeared to be from 1920. I'd never heard of any major British defeat in Iraq after World War I, so that got me curious, and when I did some digging, I was shocked to uncover a British disaster that reminded me of a mini Maiwand. For us to understand this battle, it's important to find out why the British were in Iraq in the first place in 1920. So here's the backstory to the battle. After World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to administer Iraq with the goal of eventually leading the country to independence. The British presence was also motivated by strategic interests. You guessed it, oil. Also, securing a land route to British colonies in Asia and protecting oil reserves in the region. However, the occupation faced significant resistance from Iraqi nationalists. The introduction of a new tax collecting system, replacing the old Ottoman system, was the final straw for many Arabs who revolted against the British in the summer of 1920. From a military perspective, in 1919 and 1920, the British Army faced significant strain due to its extensive global commitments. Following World War I, the Army was tasked with maintaining order and security across various global regions. The rapid demobilisation after the war left the Army with limited resources as well, making it challenging to reinforce existing trouble spots or respond to new conflicts. Running concurrently at the same time as the Iraq Rebellion were approximately 20,000 troops needed for the Irish Rebellion, 50,000 for war with Afghanistan and the northwest frontier, 13,000 to occupy the Rhineland as part of the Versailles Treaty, and another 27,000 to occupy parts of the Ottoman Empire, including Istanbul, not forgetting occupying parts of Persia and the Palestine Mandate. All this in addition to routine Empire garrison duty. Stretched to near breaking point, the armed forces were under huge pressure and could only initially send 3 divisions and some ad hoc elements of troops to police Iraq, mainly drawing from their Indian army. The British thought air power could make up for lack of numbers. Britain, having demobilised and run down its forces in Mesopotamia since 1918, was totally unprepared when the conflict started. Just think, the US occupation of Iraq in the 2000s consisted of around 120 to 140,000 men, plus another 6,000 or so allies, say. The British were attempting to do it with around 50 to 60,000 men, plus a similar amount of locally raised Iraqi soldiers and levies. Growing resentment at the British exploded into violence beginning in May 1920 when a train near Al-Shakat was ambushed by insurgents. Capturing the train, the insurgents searched the train for non-Muslims to kill. Many Muslim Indian soldiers risked their own lives protecting their Sikh comrades by throwing blood on them, claiming them to be dead, or covering them with their own bodies. Incidentally, I've seen so many of these anecdotes from conflicts such as the Northwest Frontier, Afghanistan, and fighting the Ottomans in World War I, when Muslim Indian troops risked their own lives to protect their Hindu or Sikh comrades when captured by an extremist Islamic foe, or refusing quarter or mercy given to them by an Islamic enemy, preferring death to the dishonour of surrender, or abandoning their comrades. Attacks increased down the Tigris River Valley and then southern Iraq, with British garrisons increasingly becoming cut off, besieged, and convoys ambushed. By mid-July, it was thought that up to 35,000 Arab tribesmen had risen up in arms. Amongst the British leadership, there was concern over a small British garrison located at Al-Kufa, near Najaf, a city that was known as a hotspot for anti-British sentiment. Attempts by British political officers to bribe local key Arab leaders failed, and the outpost at Al-Kufa was attacked and laid siege to. A nearby railway line ran from Hillah to Kifl. This had helped provide logistical support to the Al-Kufa garrison. On the 23rd of July, Kifl station was then attacked by insurgents and the railway staff were held captive. The local political officer requested a show of force in the area to prevent the local Arab tribes rising up in support of their brethren in Najaf. The nearest significant British garrison was at Hillah. Later that day in the afternoon, on the 23rd of July, the ill-fated Manchester column was dispatched from Hillah to show the flag and deter wavering tribesmen from joining the revolt. A Colonel Hardcastle was in command of the column. He was 44 years old, a DSO recipient, and a veteran with 23 years army experience and also having served in Iraq during World War I. Before leaving, Hardcastle was instructed by his superior officers, if opposed by large hostile forces, you will avoid becoming so involved as to necessitate reinforcements. And should occasion arise, you will fall back on the position you now occupy. He was also instructed, for the time being, to only advance halfway along the route to a water well. Many other officers in the column, and especially the Indian troops, were experienced fighting in the Middle East during World War I. The main element in the column, however, were 3 companies of the Manchester Regiment. This regiment had been expecting to ship out from the UK to India, but was diverted for service in Iraq. Many of the World War I veterans by this time of the regiment had been replaced by batches of raw recruits. I've seen one unverified source say that 60% of the junior ranks were under 21 years old. These were mainly Lancashire lads from the gritty northern towns such as Salford and Manchester, quite unused to the scorching sun of the Middle East. However, with veteran senior officers that had served in the Middle East, you would assume that logistical and operational planning would be shipshape and squared away. No. The column of between 800 and 1,000 men set out from Hillah with an inadequate water supply and carried an unnecessarily large amount of wagons containing personal items. Planners just assumed water to be on the route at the water wells and left without conducting any real form of reconnaissance on the route to check. Furthermore, no alternative route was agreed on in case of any issues. When they arrived at the wells, Hardcastle was shocked to find the water brackish and undrinkable, and the local irrigation canals also low on water. The landscape was as flat as a snooker or billiard table, with many of the irrigation canals in the locality bone dry at the height of summer. Bear in mind, this is south-central Iraq in July. The temperature in the shade is 120 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm sure some of you watching may have served, lived or worked in Iraq and can agree the summer heat is like an oven. With nothing to protect themselves and keep them cool other than solar toppies and baggy shorts, the pale Lancashire lads of the Manchesters were soon withering in the heat. Bizarrely, British Army water discipline at the time discouraged troops from drinking during the heat of the day, believing it to be detrimental to their long-term health. There were no electrolyte or camelback drinks for these chaps on the march. Men, especially from the new drafts of the Manchester Regiment, unaccustomed to the Iraqi climate, soon began collapsing from heat stroke and dehydration. The troops were forced to ignore their original order and continue marching towards Kufa and find another canal with water, known as the Rustamiyah Canal. There the men could make camp overnight and rest and hydrate themselves and their horses. The prolonged search for water and communications issues with Hillah led to the column having to pause and camp overnight, waiting for divisional permission to continue the march. These delays meant that the column did not depart on the morning of the 24th of July until after 0900 hours, when it was already over 100 Fahrenheit. A few hours later, the column reached the Rustamiyah Canal. 60% of the Manchesters were so exhausted by the march, the medical officer stated the column needed to rest for a full 24 hours. However, the objective of Kifl was in sight, the minarets of the town's mosques being seen in the distance. The medical officer's advice was put aside. Hardcastle decided then to establish a camp and got his men working on constructing defences such as trenches, giving them little opportunity for any rest. He also sent out the Sindh cavalry to act as a picket screen to the south. A short while later, in the early evening, the sound of gunfire was heard in the distance. Very soon after, the pickets came thundering in. Hot on their heels from the direction of Kilf were over 3,000 Arab tribesmen. An increasingly intense firefight then erupted, with the British bringing the 18-pounders of the field artillery into action. Arab fighters tried to get around the flanks of the camp, closing to around 150 yards of the camp's perimeter. So, as commander, what would you do next? Continue to dig into your position and hope for relief? You have plenty of ammunition, the camp is reasonably defensible, and you have access to water from the nearby canal. Or do you withdraw? Either way, after consultation perhaps with one or two of your most senior officers, you would make a decisive and swift decision. Hardcastle's judgment, however, seems to have failed, and he dithered, calling all officers to a council of war to debate what to do. After debate, Hardcastle decided to take the advice of his political officers, not his military officers. The POs believed by staying there on the defensive, this would encourage the local Arab tribes to rise up even more against the British, and urged withdrawal. Hardcastle would now make a decision which would have devastating implications. Using his orders not to engage with superior forces as justification, he ordered the Manchester column to hastily abandon the camp and retreat back towards Hillah under the cover of darkness. Unknown to Hardcastle, again due to more communications cock-ups, reinforcements would have been able to relieve him in the next 24 hours, and if they had dug in, they would have likely been able to hold their positions. However, the die was cast. The column moved off at 20:40 hours. B Company of the Manchesters acted as an advance guard and split into two files either side of the supply wagons and artillery. They would be followed by A&D companies. The Sikh pioneers and Sindh horse, tough grizzled men used to the scorching climate of the northwest frontier, and who had fared better on the scorching march, were ordered to take the critical position of rear guard. Incidentally, the commanding officer of the Sindh horse was the only senior officer with any experience fighting Arabs. The Arab tribesmen shadowed the column, subjecting it to harassing fire. Like the Pathans of the northwest frontier, they understood that a force could be at its most vulnerable when withdrawing. Very soon, in the darkness, transport animals panicked and stampeded, charging through the Manchesters, trampling men and causing casualties amongst A and B companies. Sensing weakness and using the night as cover, mounted Arabs managed to infiltrate the column and get amongst the troops, cutting down many transport animals and their drivers. Panic ensued, and the Arabs pressed home their attack. From now on, any sense of an organised military formation disintegrated. Individual bands of Indian and British troops would be fighting for their lives against swarms of Arab horsemen and foot soldiers. The field artillery then opened up on the Arabs at almost point-blank range. Only the Sind horse, making repeated charges, beating back the enemy with their sabres, prevented the artillery being wiped out and all the guns captured. During this desperate fight, the cavalrymen distinguished themselves. Multiple officers had horses shot underneath them. The British officers of the Sind horse were also seriously wounded. That Rasalda Major Muhammad Azim had to lead multiple charges, inspiring his men until he too was fatally wounded in the stomach. His conduct was described as showing the greatest coolness and bravery throughout the fighting. Azim was awarded the Indian Order of Merit. We will go into more detail on this medal at some point in a future video, but to summarise, the Indian Order of Merit was the equivalent of a Victoria Cross until 1911, when Indians could also be awarded the medal. So in 1920, it was loosely based on the equivalent of a military cross. At this point, Captain George Henderson of D Company rallied some men, ordered them to fix bayonets, and led a charge into the nearest mass of insurgents. These men forced the Arabs to withdraw temporarily. However, the Arab fighters recovered and then once again came on. Henderson yet again launched another bayonet charge with his men, and this time was fatally wounded. This bayonet charge, though, allowed the surviving men of D Company to escape up the road to Hillah. Henderson later died on the route after being laid down and saying to his men, "I'm done now. Don't let them beat you." Captain Henderson was awarded the Victoria Cross for his heroism. B Company of the Manchesters became disorientated and veered off the Hillah road towards the west. At some point, they were surrounded and overwhelmed by masses of Arab horsemen. Lost in the darkness, these men would never be seen alive again, their exact fate unknown. A contemporary survivor describes the men of B Company being slaughtered to a man. Of the Manchesters and field artillery, only the remnants of A Company and 2 guns out of 6 finally managed to get to Hillah by the dawn. 1 field gun was abandoned and captured by the insurgents, as well as a large amount of ammunition and Lewis guns. I would assume the 4 outstanding artillery pieces were either spiked or destroyed on the retreat, or later recovered. The Sind cavalry and a portion of the pioneers were singled out for recovering and conducting an effective and orderly rearguard action, but overall it was a disaster. What is frustrating is that there's no clear agreement on the exact number of casualties from this engagement. Sources vary. Colonel Mansell from the 35th Sind Horse stated that of the Manchesters, 210 men were killed or missing, and another 70 of them were captured and later released by the insurgents. The Sind Horse lost 22 dead and another 25 captured, and the Pioneers lost 24 men and 6 wounded out of 141 men. Other more conservative sources state 178 dead or missing, 60 wounded and 150 captured. That's still around a 40 to 50% overall casualty rate from a force of 800 to 1,000 men. Terrible. Many of the prisoners of the Manchester Regiment faced a tragic and grisly end. Figures are not exact, but allegedly dozens of prisoners were marched to Najaf and then executed. Another 70 men of the Manchesters were put in the city's prison and later released after negotiations. The Khan al-Shilan prison is now a museum, and some rooms still preserve graffiti on their walls scribbled by these captured British troops in 1920. During this action, several gallantry medals were awarded. These were the award of a Victoria Cross, 2 bars to the Military Cross, 2 military crosses, a bar to a Distinguished Conduct Medal, 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 5 military medals, 2 Indian Orders of Merit, and 2 Indian Distinguished Service Medals. In conclusion, and also with the benefit of hindsight, we can see several causes for the defeat. I've made some notes here of what my thoughts are. You can agree or disagree, but this is what my opinion is. Number 1, poor reconnaissance. The British assumed there would be water en route and took too much baggage, denying them freedom of movement in a terrain with no cover, intersected with dried up canals that were ideal for insurgent fighters. Number 2, no clear mission objective. The column was hastily sent and given vaguely worded instructions. This led to command indecision, and decisions were made which were politically motivated rather than tactically sound. Number 3, ignoring the climate. So sending inexperienced and unacclimatized troops out in the heat of July in Iraq, that was a recipe for trouble. Communications issues. During the march, the column had suffered from poor communications with HQ in Hillah, which had led to frequent delays. So overall, in my opinion, it just reeked of complacency. Having read a book about the Maiwand disaster in Afghanistan recently, I can draw many comparisons. In my view, this is almost like a mini Maiwand. Many of the decisions made at Maiwand mirror the decisions made here with the Manchester column. Rushing further reinforcements to Iraq from across the empire, the Iraqi Revolt of 1920 was largely suppressed by the British by the end of October 1920. The uprising, which began in central Iraq and spread to various regions, was also diffused through complex negotiations with influential tribes. Although the revolt achieved some initial successes, the British military's superior firepower and strategic advantages eventually quelled the rebellion. The conflict resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, with estimates of around 2,050 British and Indian troops killed or wounded and 6,000 to 10,000 Iraqi insurgents killed. The revolt officially ended in 1922, but it would have a lasting impact on Iraq's path to independence. For researching this video, I used Ian Rutledge's excellent book, Enemy on the Euphrates. This gives a very good account of the Great Arab Revolt in Iraq and the events leading up to it. It's well worth a read if you are interested in that part of the world. Also, shameless plug, but if you are interested in British and Indian history and medal collecting, you might want to take a look at my book, Clasps of Courage. Unlike the huge valuations of medals of participants from other British disasters such as Isandlwana or Maiwand, Manchester Regiment or other units involved in this engagement are still comparatively reasonably priced, although due to their comparatively limited numbers they can be scarce to find. A slightly different one from me today. I hope you found some value from it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.